The sexual life of a slave in ancient Rome was marked by a lack of autonomy and the absolute control that masters exercised over their bodies. As legal property of their owners, slaves had no rights over their own destiny, and this included their sexual life. Here is a description of what their experience was like and the different circumstances they might face. 1. Ownership and lack of consent. Slaves were considered property of their masters, who had the right to dispose of their bodies as they wished. This meant that owners could use slaves for their own sexual pleasures or to satisfy the desires of others, without the slave's opinion being of any relevance. The concept of consent, as we understand it today, did not exist for enslaved people. If a master wanted to have sex with a slave, the slave did not have the right to refuse. 2. Slaves as concubines. Some slaves were kept as permanent concubines by their masters, meaning they had an exclusive and more or less stable sexual relationship with them. Concubines did not enjoy the same status as a free wife, but they could sometimes receive relatively better treatment compared to other slaves. However, they were still at the mercy of the master, who could abandon them, sell them, or cast them aside if they lost interest. 3. Forced prostitution. Female slaves could also be forced to work in brothels or used as prostitutes to generate income for their masters. Prostitution in ancient Rome was legal and socially accepted, but conditions for female slaves in these establishments were extremely harsh. They were subjected to grueling hours and were often physically and sexually abused. In some cases, female slaves were used in the notorious lupanars, or houses of prostitution, especially in places such as Pompeii, where erotic frescoes and graffiti have been found that bear witness to this practice. 4. Domestic slaves and relationships with other slaves. In the domestic context, some female slaves might be subjected to sexual relations with other slaves at the command of their masters. This might occur to encourage procreation and thus increase the number of slaves on the property. A slave's children were also born slaves, thus perpetuating the condition of servitude. Although female slaves could form emotional relationships with other slaves, any aspect of their lives could be controlled or interrupted by the wishes of their master. 5. Entertainment at banquets and orgies. Female slaves were also used for entertainment at banquets and events hosted by the Roman elite. These banquets sometimes included sexual spectacles, in which female slaves participated to satisfy the appetites of the guests. They could be forced to dance naked, perform erotic acts, or participate in orgies, without having any ability to refuse these demands. In this context, their bodies were treated as mere objects of pleasure. 6. Punishments and sexual abuse. Female slaves who failed to please their masters sexually could be severely punished. Physical and sexual abuse were part of everyday life for many female slaves, and corporal punishment was a common method of discipline. Rape was seen more as a transgression against the master's property, if committed by someone other than the owner, than as an offense to the slave's person. 7. Emancipation through sexuality. In some cases, a slave could gain the favor of her master through her sexual relationship with him and be freed as a result. However, this was neither common nor guaranteed, and depended largely on the will of the owner. Manumission, or the freeing of a slave, often required some form of exceptional service or years of loyalty, and was not always due to an emotional relationship. 8. Position in the hierarchy of the slaves. Not all female slaves faced the same conditions. There was a hierarchy within the world of slavery. For example, female slaves who worked in brothels or in the fields generally had harsher conditions and fewer opportunities to escape sexual abuse. In contrast, female domestic slaves who served in wealthy households, especially those who acted as ladies-in-waiting or personal maids, might have somewhat better treatment. However, this did not mean that they were free from sexual advances from the master or other family members. 9. Social stigma. Although prostitution and relationships with slaves were socially accepted, these women were often viewed with disdain by society. The stigma associated with being a sex slave could persist even if the woman managed to obtain freedom. In the Roman mindset, honor and dignity were privileges of free citizens, and slaves were marked by their lack of autonomy and their exploitation. 10. Lack of control over motherhood. Female slaves had no control over motherhood. If they became pregnant as a result of an affair with their master or through being used as a prostitute, they could not decide the fate of their child. Children were automatically born slaves, and the master had the right to separate them from their mothers, sell them, or exploit them as labor. In ancient Rome, the system of slavery included sexual exploitation as a common form of abuse. A slave's sexual life was a reflection of her status as a property object, with few rights and subject to the whims of her masters. Although some slaves managed to improve their conditions or even obtain freedom, most lived in a reality marked by absolute control and a lack of personal autonomy.